this is Swapnil Bharti, and today we have with us Shuah Khan. I have been tracking you forever, and finally I got to sit down and talk to you.
Great.
And the first thing that I really want to know is about your journey, because you're dealing with, Kernel, which is one of the most complicated, piece and lower level code. But before we talk about Kernel, let's talk about your journey. How did you get started with technology? When you grew up, were you playing with Legos or?
No. Well, Legos, I grew up in India, didn't have Legos, but I did have building toys, the very basic building toys. So let me see, I really love math. I just loved it. So as I was growing up, I wanted to be, in my 9th grade or 10th grade, I wanted to be a mathematician. And then after that changed into nuclear physics.
Okay.
And then that became engineering. So by the time I was in 12th grade, I wanted to pursue engineering. So I went into engineering college to get my electronics and communications degree in bachelor's. And it was good. I enjoyed it. I took a couple of programming classes in my 3rd, 4th year of college, which I just loved. I have this mix of creativity and technology in my head. Software engineering is the best outlet for that. When you are a different kind of creativity, it's like creating art,
right?
Putting pieces together and puzzle together. I loved that aspect. And because of my background in electronics and communications, I had a little bit of a learning curve to become, pick up and get a master's in computer science. I came to US to do master's in computer science. I went to CSU, Colorado State University in the foothills of Rockies. And then that's where I live even now. I just love that area. So when I was doing my master's, I started focusing on graphics because that was kind of a little bit of a area that I'm familiar with. So I did a lot of graphics application user level programs and then switched into doing middleware graphics. And then my 2nd year of computer science, I just fell in love with operating systems. So I started focusing more and more on operating systems. And then as I started working with various companies, and then I worked in embedded space a lot. One of the places I worked at was AT&T, then became Lucent, where we built these verticals with the hardware, real-time OS on top, middleware, and then these large PBX, large telephone things. So these are all vertical times. Now we don't have virtual. So as I was doing that, I was doing more and more kernel work. And then I worked for Hewlett-Packard, where I was doing HPUX, HP Unix. And then that's where I got started on open source. It's a transition. And I was working in a closed source OS, and then I was using Linux a lot. And then I wanted to start doing open source work. And then HP Hewlett-Packard has open source lab. So I started to explore possibilities of switching from the project I was on to HP's open source lab, in which I did. And then I started working in middleware, and I did Open HPI, which is the hardware layer for interface layer for HP's platforms. And then slowly I started doing Linux kernel work internally at HP for some of the products. And then I decided that I really want to contribute a lot more to Linux. And then I started working, while I was at HP, I started working weekends and my holidays and for a year before I actually started working full-time in Linux space. So for a year or so, I was doing a lot of. So the challenge in my journey, I would say, is that even being a mathematician or having aspirations to be an engineer, at the time I was growing up, I mean, even now I see that. Even now, I have 2 boys. As I go to schools, I see there is always a different kinds of projects that girls and boys, either they're directed to or picked. So And girls' projects tend to be more on nutrition or something related to more acceptable things, like maybe studying how much bacteria is on a toothbrush versus boys are more into doing more hardcore engineering type projects. So there is that. And then as far as I know, I knew what I wanted to do. It's like it didn't matter what others were telling me that I should do. So I wanted to be an engineer, So it's more like pursuing your passion. That's more important than, because you have to get up every day and go to work. So you have to have your heart in it. So open source, as a gradual transition, now open source really makes me get up every day and go to work. So I really love it. I love the freedom that comes with being able to choose what I want to work on and put energy in the right places.
You came from proprietary world to open source world. So what was the difference that you noticed?
One big thing is expectation. People talk about a lot of other things like reviews, code reviews, or getting more peer reviews kind of thing. But to me, the big difference is expectation of getting your code accepted into the project. When you are in a proprietary operating system or proprietary closed project, yes, your code gets reviewed in a group of peers that you have on the project, but at the end of the day, it'll get in. So the big difference is that in open source, there is no guarantee that what you do will actually get accepted. So that's the big difference. That's what you have to realize when you are making the transition.
So when you contributed your first code, was it in capacity of an employee of a company or an individual capacity that you were tinkering with something and you liked it and you just submitted a patch or code?
It's a freelance. When I was, for a while there, when I was making the transition from, I wanted to be an open source developer and specifically contribute to Linux kernel, I started working freelance. And my first patch was actually to remove a piece of code from Linux kernel.
And what kind of response you got when you submitted your patch?
There is a lot of acceptance. People are very, I have had a lot of people that helped me with it. And then, I worked under the Android mainlining project kind of guys, but under that umbrella. However, I did get a lot of good response.
So when you submitted your patch, did you submit under your name or, because sometimes people who are not very well aware of the open source world, they think about there is a lot of, inequality there. But how was the experience for you being a woman, in that space when you submitted your patch?
So I don't know if people can even recognize my name as a woman's name or a man's name, for one thing. Possibly, that's an advantage. But I have never, I did not feel that. For one, it could be me. For my personality is that I don't worry about whether I belong in a particular space. I have had to do that all my life, working in a kernel space, even in a closed source projects. First of all, people will look at you like, okay, what is she doing here? Kind of, sometimes, some people, not all of them, some people. So there is that, so I have learned to play in that space from the beginning. So my attitude would be, okay, I belong here. I am going to do what I do best and let time be the judge of it.
Yeah, you have to
and
claim
people
it.
change, yeah.
You have to claim
exactly.
it. Yeah,
exactly. You have to take ownership and you have to say, hey, I have right to sit at the table and act like it.
Right. A lot of time I have seen stories where, women don't feel, comfortable in such an environment. This was online. But when you met, in person with the community, what was the reaction or what was your experience?
So mixed. Some people were great. I mean, some people knew me. First time I came to the project, some people already knew that I was participating already. So, and some people thought, interestingly, I thought I was a manager or general stereotypical reaction does come into play, and I still face that sometimes. General stereotypical thing, as anybody would face. You just have to ignore a lot of that. It's
Right.
just a matter of, even if I see that a lot. If I even in a social setting, we would go and meet somebody, my husband and I say, for example, and everybody would ask what he does, but nobody would ask what I do. So,
Yeah.
but you have to kind of push through and ignore a lot of that and just not take it personally and keep going. And keep an eye on the ball and keep going.
You talked about your experience submitting the code. What has been your experience working within the open source community? Because this is a community where people from different parts of the world, different backgrounds, it doesn't matter where you are from. How has been your experience?
Positive. A lot of it is positive. There are days I go, man, people can be a little bit diplomatic in a way they express what they don't like. However, I do realize it's a community of 6, 7, or 10,000 people. There are always people. Their personality shows through, and some people are more frank and outspoken than others. And then also, maintainers sometimes can be overloaded, and they are dealing with lots of patches. So impatience and all of that comes into play. It's a human.
Exactly.
So human experience. So if I do feel like the negative feedback, I usually step back and then let things settle down in my head before I go back and respond. I try to respond with an even keel to even for responses that come at me that might be a little bit negative.
Okay. And you have also worked in the proprietary world before that as a technologist, and now you're in open. So from social or cultural point of view, did you experience any difference that, okay, open source world is more welcoming versus?
One thing with open source culture is it is more welcoming, more open. There is, people are more accepting of diversity. When diversity, I mean that people from across the globe, in terms of probably the open source is the very first time I felt like I don't have to explain accent I might have, because we all have accents. So it feels like it's a more of a place I belong. It's a global community as opposed to a small pond, if you will.
Right. We talked about some, diversity issue. One of the questions that the kernel community always get, actually not one, two questions. First of all, the kernel community is aging. The top level maintainers, all
Right.
40 plus. So what are you guys doing to get the fresh blood there, to ensure that new people will keep coming in there?
That is a tough part. I think we do have newer people coming in various areas, and also the way it works is kernel is trust building, right? Even if you have to participate, and it takes a different mindset to be a maintainer versus a developer. Maintainer, Linus says this in his one-on-ones and interviews sometimes when he talks about it. Maintainer's job is harder in some ways. It's a 24/7, you have to be there and you have to make sure, and you are essentially the responsible for the subsystem that you're committing patches into. And there is a burnout. And maintainers have to decide when that burnout happens. And we generally, as a community, we don't like to push maintainers out, obviously, for good reasons, because they know the area. Then they have shown commitment to the project for a long time. And so what happens is, but that is a concern, obviously. But we continue to see new developers coming in various areas. So we have to, as maintainers, I kind of keep an eye on, I keep thinking about it at the back of my mind. So what happens when maybe I don't want to do this anymore. Or, I mean, it's always a possibility, right? 10 years, 5 years from down the road. So as a maintainer, what I do is I kind of keep looking at, okay, who could take the responsibility from me? So sometimes it would help. Some subsystems do this. They have a group of maintainers that do that. Not all subsystems have that luxury of having multiple competent and developers that are experienced in that particular subsystem. So yeah, it is a problem, and I think it's some of it is it's not overall a community, somebody solving the problem. It has to happen as maintainers think about what next for that subsystem.
Well, you're answering the question. I was also thinking about what I have noticed over the period of 13 years I've been covering Linux was also that it doesn't matter, like those maintainers, they will move from one company to another company, but they still do the same thing. So one reason is we see the same people. In other words, what happens is you change job, you just move out of that field and do something else. But in open source world, what I've seen is same people are there, they just keep moving around from one company to other company, but they still do the same thing.
Right. You are taking the work with you. That is the beauty of open source, right?
Right.
Because there is that sense of freedom. When I was talking about, there is I talked about one difference between closed and open. The other difference is that you have the work you do in open source is yours. It doesn't belong to a company. You take it with you. So I take the work I have done. So that is another reason you see the same people. It is not necessarily a bad thing.
No, it's a good thing.
Not. It is from a different perspective. It's not so much that you see a maintainer's continuing long term is that longevity of a sense of ownership of the subsystem. So that is a double-edged sword, right? When you develop a sense of, it's almost like a baby. You have to be able to give up the baby. And so that's another thing that comes in. Even when somebody reaches a burnout, they do not know how to give that up because that defines their life in open source. Defines their life in Linux kernel space. So it becomes difficult, but as a responsible maintainer at some point, all maintainers, we all have to reach a point where we have to find somebody to hand this off.
So you did touch upon, that there is a bit of challenge of getting a maintainers, and you're like, if I, feel like I have to move out. So is there any processes developed by the kernel communities so that if a new maintainer comes, to replace you, so you have created some kind of, documentation or some kind of mentorship so that they can very easily take over the helm from you?
So it does happen on occasion. If you, in the last, as I notice, people take over. Usually the way it happens is there is a process for that. There is one process for that. And developers that are very knowledgeable in a specific area, they can start being reviewers. Some people do that. There is a special reviewer status. Some subsystems use that as a stepping stone to taking over as a maintainer, if the maintainer. So usually there will be an overlap. It very often happens sometimes behind the scenes because it's not announced until the person is ready to take over. But there is a learning curve when then coming up to see maintainer and then a developer that the maintainer trusts. There is a relationship, and sometimes they work together to bring the second person up to and then replace. And it does happen. There are a few examples of that happening and people giving up their subsystem to somebody they trust.
This is a funny question and we may remove it, but is it possible at one point in the future we'll see all kernel maintainers will be women only?
I don't think so.
That will be a very monotonous environment.
Yes. Well, I mean...
But it will be very efficient and effective.
It would be the coin flipping the other way, right?
Right.
And just now Van Jones was talking about cognitive diversity. Yeah. And sometimes, I would I wouldn't want to see that happening.
We would rather
for good
see
reasons.
very mixed, you know.
For good
or
reasons.
whatever I mean, to some extent, it also makes sense, you know, the people, as long as you create an environment which is welcoming, best people will come either way. And people perceive, I have been covering Linux kernel community for so long, it's a very welcome and very open, you know, word. People sometimes pick what Linus says on LKML, but you have to also see the gap between and what happened. Controversy sells. So people like to sell it, but they forget that what led to it, who he's interacting. If you go and sit in the boardroom of any office, or just when they play sports, just listen to what coach talks to his team.
Right.
You will have heart attack, you know.
Right.
So
I would say though that it takes a certain kind of personality to have thousands of people look at the work you have done and pick it apart. Not so much pick it apart. At the same time, the rewards and risks, you have to outweigh that. The reward of getting recognition in a field of 6,000, 10,000 developers or great minds is very rewarding. And at the same time, when you have so many great minds, and your work will be looked at more critically. And it is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Right.
And so I kind of take it as a process. So
And if you look at the way Linux is powering so many things, there isn't much scope for error, you know, if you look at that.
Correct.
You know, spaceships are running, you know, NASA or stock exchange, mission critical applications running, our mobile phones, home, Nest. I mean, it's like everywhere, so you have to be careful. Okay, now let's stop talking about technology for a while. Let's talk about you. I mean, we start with you, but when you're not doing all this kernel stuff, when you're not doing mathematics, what do you do in your free time? Please don't say that in free time I just read LKML.
No. I read a lot. I have 2 boys, and with both of them, as they are reading various things like Harry Potter or Heroes of Olympus series, I read with them. Right now, I'm reading Heroes of Olympus. So I enjoy reading. I enjoy reading a lot, and then I travel a lot, and then hiking. Okay. I do a lot of hiking, and I love to do both snowshoeing and hiking. Okay. And I live in a perfect place for that, Rockies, so it's awesome. So yes, I have a life outside the kernel community. I want it that way because someday, you know.